Glenford Mitchell, and she really wants to sit down.
The Subcommittee on International Organizations and Human Rights will come to order. This subcommittee is charged with overseeing our human rights policy, and over this past session of Congress, we've attempted to identify religious persecution as a form of human rights violation. The subcommittee has conducted 2 sets of hearings now, dealing principally with an overview, the general nature of religious persecution, what constitutes religious persecution, how we define it, and then eventually as policy, how we can deal with it as an aspect of human rights. Today, we're starting a new set of hearings attempting to focus on specific examples of human rights violations as they relate to religious persecution. And we have chosen the situation involving the Baha'is of Iran as our lead-off example. And we had no problem in identifying this as perhaps the best example of how this violation occurs in an area of the world and among a religious sect that has experienced a century of religious persecution. What's ironic in this case is that the Baha'is are gentle and peace-loving. They have a rather magnanimous faith that is all-embracing. And in accordance with the tenets of their faith, they uphold the divine origin of all the major world religions. So rather than being fairly narrow in scope, the Baha'is are fairly outreaching in their faith and in their invitation for others to join. And since the United States has no leverage with the Iranian government, given the fact that we do not officially recognize that government today, trying to find a policy that will directly apply and bring about a change of that government's policy is indeed difficult. Through private channels and public exposure, we must continue to pressure the Reagan administration to do more and the Iranian government to put a stop to this genocide. In the last 2 years, the subcommittee has made every effort to make sure that the Baha'i are granted asylum in the United States. Every effort must also be made to call to the attention of world public opinion the plight of the Baha'is. And this hearing is a step in that process. Now, we have some distinguished witnesses today, and the lead-off is one of the most distinguished members of the Congress and who serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and judging by his appearance, you would think that he's experienced some form of persecution. Maybe several forms of persecution, but he's a person who has come through it all with a great deal of grace and dignity, and is still a very strong leader on this committee. Mr. Dewensky and our colleague Mr. Stark have been in the forefront of advancing the cause of the Baha'is, have brought this committee's attention to their plight a long time ago. So I think it's only appropriate that our lead-off witness be Honorable Edwin Dewensky of the state of Illinois. Mr. Dewensky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to insert a complete statement in the record along with related material, and then I'll just summarize it.
Yes, your official statement will, of course, be included in the record.
I appreciate your special interest in the case of the Baha'i community, and I should like to point out that the world was forewarned of this tragedy, because as soon as the Ayatollah and that fanatical regime seized power in Iran, the Baha'is realized that they would bear the brunt of a great deal of prejudice, and they unfortunately were correct in their analysis. My first contact goes back to the first weeks after the Ayatollah returned to Iran, when, as a matter of a systematic policy, the Baha'i leaders and their normal members have been subjected to arrest, disappearance. Their cemeteries have been desecrated, and this hasn't been something with just local or even regional. This was obviously planned, and I think it fits the definition of genocide, an effort to stamp out this religious community.
Mr. Hyde, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Congressman Derwinski, I want to congratulate you for your foresight. You have been bringing this tragedy to the attention of Congress at least for a year, to my knowledge. You took the floor in July of last year and called for these hearings and pointed out the persecution of the Baha'i people in Iran. But isn't there something we can do more than pass resolutions condemning their action?
I would say that we should look upon this as the first step. I would hope that we could in some way dramatize these resolutions, because we're starting, let me point out, Mr. Hyde, a problem where we really have to, in effect, educate the people, and in fact we have to start educating the media as to the plight of these poor Baha'is.
I think, Mr. Hyde, the very fact that we're conducting hearings will serve to focus attention on the plight of the Baha'is, and it's been our experience in the past that merely holding hearings and bringing forth witnesses who will disclose the extent of persecution or of human rights violations wherever they occur often has in itself an impact. But the chairman is open to suggestions and ways in which we can more effectively deal with this issue. Mr. Stark, it's really a pleasure to have you and to know of your interest in this subject, and we're looking forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify to before your subcommittee today and to express and add my concern to that of others in the Congress who believe that we should condemn and oppose the repression and possibly, I would term it, genocide of the Baha'is in Iran. I believe you have a full text of my statement, and I would ask that it appear in your record in its entirety, and I will attempt to summarize it. I just think that where you have a group of people for a long time who've been concerned with world order and peace and love and friendship and humanity, and I suspect not very political, to suddenly be repressed and oppressed for a variety of reasons that tend to focus largely, it seems to me, on where the Baha'is happen to live or have political offices. The accusations that have been forthcoming from Iran are that they are subversive and heretical, and that they are a political party, and that they are agents of all kinds of foreign powers, ourselves, Russia, British imperialism. I probably now find that they're agents of the Argentinians. They are spies for all of those varied and assorted countries, and if they're smart enough to collect from both us and Russia at the same time, probably we ought to embrace them. They have a world center in Israel, which of course leads them just by definition to be hostile to Iran and the Islamic Revolution, and they travel to Israel, and I think you can get the tenor of the accusations that I'm sure that we would all feel are either coincidental or mean very little. But I want to thank you for helping those of us who are concerned focus attention on, I think, what would be unanimously considered inhumane treatment. I would like to work with this committee in any way that I could to see if we can bring some sense of justice and some resolution to the problem which exists. I appreciate your taking the time to build a record and for letting me contribute some small way to it. Thank you.
Mr. Barnes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any questions. I just want to commend the gentleman from California for his leadership on this. I had the chance to meet shortly after the revolution in Iran with the representatives of the new revolutionary government here in Washington. I went to see them to talk with them about religious persecution issues. A number of Baha'is from my district and a number of Jews from my district had come to me expressing concern about the problems of religious minorities in Iran, and this was before we really had seen what was going to unfold in that country. It was before the hostages were taken and whatnot. And I went over to talk with the top people here at the embassy, and I was really taken back by what I was told. I was told that there would be no persecution of religious minorities in Iran. But of course, you have to understand the Baha'is are not a religious minority. Baha'is are a political party. And there was no assurance at all given to me, or I gathered anybody else, that they would not be persecuted. So it was almost as though it was a formal policy statement by the representatives of that government that the Baha'is that there was open season on the Baha'is. It was a very scary statement to hear, and I gather there's been nothing in the interim to change the atmosphere and to give us any confidence that the Baha'is are not, in almost a matter of official policy, being persecuted. So what you're doing, Pete, is very important, and I just want to let you know I'll be happy to help in any way that I can.
Thank you. Appreciate the gentleman's interest in this
Mr. Gates.
problem.
I don't have any question either. I just want to applaud the gentleman from California. Someone who's a freshman here, and you often sit outside of government circles wondering where the voices are in America where things like this go on. And we always, after the fact, look back after the full horror is brought out to the public and say, where was our government, where were our leaders when thousands or tens of thousands of people were getting killed. And I just think it's important that we do everything we can, and if we can't do anything else, we ought to at least let the American people in the world know that it's a policy that we object to and do everything we can to stop.
Well, I've had the opportunity to meet several of you before, and it's certainly a privilege to have you before the committee. And we really feel that you'll be providing the substance of the testimony that will give the Congress a better view of the situation with the Baha'is in Iran. So I think we'll start with Judge James Nelson.
For the last 3.5 years, Mr. Chairman, the Baha'i community of Iran has suffered relentless persecution. The horrors that are being inflicted upon it stagger the imagination. They constitute, without any doubt, a gross violation of all fundamental human rights. In Mian Dawab, a mob first destroyed the local Baha'i center, fell upon a Baha'i man and his son, dragged them through the streets, chopped their bodies into small pieces, and then consigned those pieces to the flames. In Nook, a farming village near Birjand, 15 masked men attacked a couple in their home at night. They poured kerosene on the husband and made him run. When he collapsed, they poured more kerosene upon him, placed wood upon the burning kerosene, and finished the cremation. His wife was subjected to similar treatment and died a few days later. In Shiraz, 300 Baha'i homes were burned. In Tehran, bodies of executed Baha'is were written upon in large script. And we have a photograph to show the ghoulish markings on the bodies indicating the epithet, enemy of Islam. In Yazd, following the execution of 7 Baha'is, including an 85-year-old man.
Excuse me, is there writing on the bodies? Is there a translation for that, just so we... Well,
among other things, the saying enemy of Islam is...
Okay, just for the record, I'd like to know what the various writings are.
Here it says, Brazil, beyond the name, Evin prison, the 2,936 execution
No,
on the
I'm
53rd
sorry.
day.
There's writing on the bodies.
That's what it says.
Oh,
That's what the writing says. And the date of the execution. This says Bazarg al-Avian, enemy of Islam.
I see.
Yes, and others are similarly described.
With respect to the other photograph, the Yazd executions, the authorities after these executions presented the widows of these men with bills to cover the cost of the bullets used for the execution.
These were the authorities.
Yes. In legal matters, in Tehran, the High Court of Justice upheld a verdict of the Shiraz Revolutionary Court that membership in a Baha'i assembly is a crime punishable by death. Since that verdict, more than 60 Baha'i leaders have been executed. The Iranian Baha'is, as you have noted, Mr. Chairman, have no redress for these grievances. The Constitution of the Islamic Republic does not recognize the Baha'i faith, despite the fact that similar religious minorities are recognized. Thus, patient and repeated appeals of the Baha'is to the authorities fall on deaf ears. It is the task of the Baha'is of other lands to help their Iranian co-religionists by calling the attention of the world to the horrors that are now being perpetrated in the name of religion. On too many occasions in this century, the world averted its eyes when fanatics, demagogues, and dictators massacred national, racial, and religious minorities, filled concentration camps with class enemies, or deprived of their most fundamental rights all those who dared to differ from their brutal orthodoxies, even in thought. Humanity cannot afford to remain silent, and by its silence to condone evil. We, the Baha'is of the United States, feel no animosity toward the government of Iran per se. We feel genuine sympathy for the long-suffering Iranian people and wish for them a peaceful and happy future. However, we cannot remain indifferent to the sufferings of our Iranian brothers and sisters at the hands of bigots who have no compunction about shedding innocent blood. We call upon our fellow citizens and our elected representatives to proclaim that America will not acquiesce in opposition, and that the perpetrators of oppression will have to answer for their deeds in the court of world opinion.
I would like to tell you about the story of my parents. My father, Mr. Hushain Mahmoodi, he was 53 years old. He was a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Iran. He, along with all his colleagues and 2 other prominent Baha'is, they were abducted on August 21st of 1980, and they simply disappeared. We have not heard anything from my father from anybody else. And all the appeals made by the Baha'i community to the Iranian government on behalf of them they all went unheeded. And I have no doubt in my mind that they've all been killed, and perhaps they faced the most cruel death. My mother, Mrs. Yunus Mahmoodi, she was elected to the next National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Iran, and she served as its chairman. She, along with her colleagues, they were arrested on December 13th of 1981. They were taken to a prison. And for a week before they were executed, they were kept in the hallways of an interrogation hall. And anytime the Muslim guards, the Pastara, would pass by them, they would spit on them, they would hit them, and they would swear at them. And then they were executed on December 27th of 1981. Without any charges, no trials took place, and their desecrated bodies were found accidentally on a Muslim cemetery which was kept for the infidels. And no family members were notified. And before the bodies could even be claimed by the Baha'is, they had to pay for the bullets that were used to kill them. The Prosecutor General of Iran at that time denied all knowledge of their execution, but later on admitted that they were executed because they were foreign spies and not because they were Baha'is. On January 4th of 1982, about a week after my mother's execution, my cousin, Shiva Mahmoodi, she was 35 years old and the mother of 2 young children. She was a member of the local assembly of the Baha'is of Tehran. she was executed along with 6 other members of the local assembly of Tehran. And they were all given a chance to recant their faith. In fact, they were given 2 pieces of paper to sign. One of them, if they signed, they would be released. They would be converted to Islam. And the other one would send them to the execution. And not all of them stood steadfast in their faith, and they all faced their death on January 4th, 1982. In August of 1981, a cousin of my husband, Mr. Habib Tahqiqi, he was a member of a local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Tabriz. He was executed. And I have a copy of his will in my possession. And the first line of his will reads as follows, that in an hour I will be executed along with 8 other Baha'is. My only guilt is that I'm a Baha'i. I believe in all the prophets of God, including Muhammad. And most recently, on May 8, 1982, 2 of our neighbors, some of the best friends of my parents, they were executed after 10 months of imprisonment. And both of them were tortured first. All of these people were outstanding servants of their country. They were among the most educated. They served their country with honesty and sincerity, because Iran was not only the land where they were born in, it was also the land where their faith was born in. My mother traveled extensively throughout Iran, visiting Baha'i prisoners and their families, and those Baha'is who have lost their all for being a Baha'i. And she would write us stories, she would tell us about these prisoners. And one particularly effective and moving one was about 7 Baha'is, members of the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Hamadan, who were tortured to death. Since she knew them very, very personally, she was a friend of them, and she had met them in the prison several times before their execution. And I'm going to quote from her letter. She said that the news came at 9 o'clock in the morning that there are 7 bodies in the morgue. Everyone went to the morgue to see if the news was true. It was. There were 7 bloody bodies thrown on the floor. It was obvious how much disrespect and contempt had been shown even to their lifeless bodies. But more heinous was the fact that their bodies were torn apart and tortured. One had his chest cage smashed and a piece of it cut with a sharp object. Another had his fingers smashed and a piece of his stomach cut and thrown away. Another has his arm smashed, and yet another had his leg completely torn. We asked the authorities for an ambulance to deliver the bodies to the Baha'i cemetery. It was refused. But at the end, we were given an ambulance. But the ambulance was a very old one with broken windows and no doors. Thus, one more time, the authorities wanted to humiliate the Baha'is. But the result was that on the funeral procession on the route to the Baha'i cemetery, thousands of inhabitants of Hamadan who came to see these Baha'is, they were witnesses, they became witnesses to the atrocities that their government officials had committed. She said that the other day I went to visit a Baha'i child, 11 years old, whom I had heard had developed severe headaches. I asked him to relate his experience. He told me that his teacher had begun a barrage of insults and calumnies against the faith. Of course, he did not passively accept these insults. He gave impressive answers. The teacher became speechless. This delighted the other children who applauded and cried hooray for him. The teacher became angrier and left the classroom and consulted with 2 other teachers who came to the rescue. They argued and threatened and abused him and took him to a room, gave him a booklet which was written against the Baha'i faith, and compelled him to write repeatedly from this booklet certain passages which attacked the faith of Baha'u'llah in offensive language. This punishment became so great that he developed severe headaches, which the doctors said were caused by nervous pressure.
The United States Baha'i community has been in existence for more than 80 years. Its beginnings date back to the Columbian Exposition of 1893. At this event in Chicago, the name and essential teachings of Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, were first brought to public notice in the United States. Although the Baha'i faith originated in Iran, this community was established through the initiative of Americans and not through Iranian missionary activity. The vast majority of the community's 100,000 members are Native Americans, drawn from every state of the Union, from every walk of life, and from a wide spectrum of ethnic backgrounds. For example, blacks constitute some 30 to 35% of the American Baha'i population, and more than 50 Indian tribes are represented in the community. Iranians make up no more than 8% of the membership, and the majority of them arrived in the United States in the last 3 years as the persecution of the Baha'is intensified in their homeland. Mr. Chairman, we cite these concerns in the hope that the actions of our government and of our fellow citizens will have the following outcome. 1, keep the Iranian government and people constantly reminded through frequent public statements that the world is watching what they do to the Baha'is and will not tolerate it. 2, prevent Islamic Iranian fanatics in this country from curtailing the freedom which American Baha'is share with their fellow citizens to meet in peace in the United States. And 3, assist those Iranian Baha'is who seek refuge in the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to ask you a few questions about the faith, so I have a better understanding of it. In the Baha'i faith, what kind of act represents embracing the faith? Is it a matter of heredity, such as it is with Islamic or perhaps the Jewish faith, something that's carried on from generation to generation? Is it a personal and spiritual commitment that one makes to the faith, at which time he realizes that he's entered into a conversion of sorts? My interpretation is that it's fairly open and indiscriminate, but maybe you could help elaborate the faith itself and how one really experiences this religion.
Mr. Chairman, may I add one more question to your series? And are you a Christian religion or are you non-Christian?
Maybe Firooz says a convert should speak. I was raised as a Presbyterian, Mr. Dimely, and so that's my background. I think we must first of all get some basics down, which often are quite misunderstood. First of all, the Baha'is believe that there is, in essence, just one religion, that there is one God. All the religions teach this, that there is one mankind. The brotherhood of man is an essential element of the various religious systems. If there is one God speaking to a collective mankind, then the voice, however it be transmitted to man, has to be single, that there is a source of divine guidance from God, and the recipient of that divine guidance, God's purpose for man, is mankind. And we recognize that this religion has come to man in successive stages throughout history, that it arrives to man as lessons do in school, not according to the capacity of the teacher to teach, but according to the capacity of the child to learn. And so the purpose of religion from the very beginning, we believe, is to teach men about God and his purpose for man, and to teach man how to develop an advancing civilization. So that when the Baha'is tell you that they believe that divine revelation, this message of God to man, is relative and progressive, it means that it is the same message being delivered in the spiritual sense, the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the immortality of the soul, the golden rule. All of these things that run like a golden thread through all of the religions are taught eternally. But also it is progressive in the sense that it leads man to a higher sense of civilization. And as we get more and more complicated in our affairs, as we get more and more capable of perpetrating the grossest atrocities and even to extinguish life on the planet, we need more guidance in terms of how we get along as a society.
So that the Jesus that taught to people who believed the earth was flat was teaching to people of that capacity. And he taught them the same spiritual truths which are re-enunciated by Baha'u'llah for people in this cycle. But we now have a multi-atomic society, one not ever anticipated by those on the shores of Galilee, one society which stands at the very brink of exterminating itself because of a lack of a spiritual connection. So we look at the religion of God as promoting the material and civilized side of man along with the spiritual. That's why the messengers come at different times, 500 or 1,000 years apart, bearing the same spiritual truth with a new social message for the day and age in which we live. The social message for this day and age imports the oneness of the human race on the planet and the fact that we occupy this blue marble as seen from space in common, and that the destiny of this marble is the destiny of us all. And so we are all children of the same God. So if you ask me, am I Christian? If by that you mean, do I believe in Jesus Christ? Yes, Mr. Dimely, I do. But you also believe in some of the teachings of Muhammad.
I believe that Muhammad succeeded Jesus in time and brought a new level of social recognition. That the Bab and Baha'u'llah came after that to bring us even to a higher level, and that there will be another in 1,000 years or so to take whatever civilization we are able to leave here and build upon it. So this is what we're talking about,
Chairman,
and progressive.
If I may, then you would say that you're eclectic then.
If eclectic means we take the best of all that is, I would have to say you're probably right, but it is not something that we take, it's something that we've been given universally, that all men are subject to the same law. Men are subject to laws they don't even know about. And so the civilizing effect of the religion of God is here, has been, and will continue to be.
Chairman, one final comment. Then I suspect that I would be a good candidate for the Baha'i faith because my father is Muslim, my mother is Catholic, and I'm Episcopalian.
You have said it, Mr. Daimler.
The Christian faith multiplied as the persecution increased. It seemed that to gather momentum, and eventually, during the time of Constantine, then he proclaimed Christ, I think, to help boost the morale of his army or whatever, make it more of a spiritual war than a conventional one. But nonetheless, what has been the history of the Baha'is in terms of its growth? In other words, sometimes it could represent a threat to Islam, I suppose, if you've had a lot of converts and it was spreading. It was such an appealing idea or faith that more and more people were coming into it. But I don't really get the sense that that's happened with the Baha'i faith. It's been fairly self-contained, and there hasn't been a lot of evangelizing, if you will, out there trying to win over Islamic converts to the faith. But what has been the experience in that context?
I think that one of the problems that the Baha'is have faced in Iran was precisely this, that the cadre of the Baha'is in Iran was recruited largely from among the persecutors. If you look at the names of the first 18 people who accepted the Bab, the herald and predecessor of Baha'u'llah, you will find that something like 14 out of the 18 had a mullah in front of their names, and one of them was a mujtahid, what today they call ayatollah, highest ranking religious official. And indeed it was precisely as a result of persecutions that the Iranian Baha'i community grew ultimately, not immediately during the persecution or immediately after it, but a few years would pass and the persecution itself would imprint itself in the minds of so many people that they would begin to ask questions, they would begin to investigate, and frequently it was, as in the case of St. Paul, a persecutor then is converted, sometimes under very dramatic circumstances. Indeed, Mr. Chairman, to go back to the earlier allusion that you made to the personal experience, it is an indispensable condition of being a Baha'i. One must individually and personally feel before one can be a member.
What do you mean by feel?
One must have what the Quakers call a convincement. One must experience within himself the truth of the claim of Baha'u'llah. I cannot simply say, yes, I'm a Baha'i because my parents were Baha'is. I must be convinced myself, individually and personally, and make a commitment to that, to the extent of willing to sacrifice my life. Because the Baha'is, for instance, are prohibited, with an absolute prohibition, from dissimulating their faith.
Okay, now let me ask you this question, because it relates, and then I better defer to my colleagues. At one point, the Baha'is, according to the testimony today, who were victims, were asked to recant, and once again accept the Islamic faith. Now, I get the impression that you don't renounce Islam, the Islamic faith, when you accept the Baha'i faith, but they were demanding that you recant and come back to the Islamic fold. But if you never left Islam, then you don't necessarily have to come back, but you have to recant these progressive notions that are part of the Baha'i faith. And that's what it's difficult to do once you accept it. Is it such a total conversion, as it is with a Christian? I mean, if you accept that Christ is the Son of God and you embrace that faith, it's really hard to take it lightly and just say, well, I'm going to recant until I get past this purge, and then I'll...
That's right. Exactly. Exactly.
Precisely.
Yeah. The parents of Mrs. Noorani would have been alive today if they were willing simply to say, okay, I am not a Baha'i. They would have been happily living, not happily, no, but they would have been living. However, they would then have to answer to themselves. And by the way, we heard here mention of two individuals in whose home the local assembly of Tehran was having a meeting when they were arrested, and the woman refused to recant and was executed,
and the man
the husband recanted.
Yeah, I remember that.
A few weeks after his recantation, he was placed in an insane asylum. He had a very bad psychotic breakdown, and I know why. Because his wife was gone, his friends were gone, but he had to live with himself, and he couldn't take it.
Well, Judas went through the same experience.
Precisely.
I would just like to ask you, given the nature of the Baha'i non-political involvement and what is perceived to be a gentle approach to faith, why in heaven's name is it considered such an enormous threat today in a country like Iran?
The clergy know perfectly well that the Baha'i faith is not a political movement and is not a political threat. However, they know, and it is true, that it is a threat to their world outlook. It is a threat to their position as a clergy. Why do they call it a political movement? The reason initially was that with the arrival of modernity, with growing secularization, simply to talk to people about a theological problem, for instance, to say to people, a Baha'i deserves death because he does not believe that on the day of last judgment, people will be resurrected in their original bodies. The Baha'is give an allegorical interpretation to that. They believe in the resurrection of the spirit, in the rebirth of human personality. Now, anyone who believes that, according to the clergy, deserves death. However, you cannot say it in the modern world. In Iran, to the new intelligentsia, to the new technocracy, to the educated people. Now, what is it then that you should say in order to continue the hatred? They are not a religion, they are a political organization set up by the Russian ambassador, Prince Dolgoruki, in 1844, in order to disrupt Islam, later bought up by the British intelligence service, subsequently by the CIA, and now by the Zionist movement. That makes it possible even for an Iranian who is an atheist to relate to the Baha'is precisely in the way in which the mullah wants him to relate to them. And this is the only reason for all these political accusations.
Your latest convert, our distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, often we Americans are silent and not terribly involved until the issue is brought to our doorsteps. This issue is brought with some drama, and I'm personally moved and touched by the evidence we heard today. Judge, is there such a thing as asylum for religious persecution? We have asylum for political persecution. I don't know, Mr. Chairman, you may want to join us, I don't know. Do we have accommodation or law for religious persecution as we do for political persecution?
Mr. Dimley, this whole question of religious persecution is so new, and it's not even been properly defined, so I doubt very much whether we've gone that far.
I raise that issue because it seems to me that through quiet diplomacy, the members of Congress could impress upon the State Department the urgency of this problem and to increase the quota for Iranians who are persecuted because of religious belief, i.e. the Baha'is. And that is something that we can do through private channels. That's one. The other question, of course...
Mr. Donnelly, I think the record should note that, and I failed to comment on it when you posed the question, but the subcommittee has sent a number of letters to the State Department concerning this matter, and we have received responses and assurances that Baha'is would be granted asylum in the United States, and we will put those letters into the official record. But as I understand it, that isn't the answer, because Baha'is want to be able to practice their faith in their country.
Indeed.
Yes, most of them, of course, have no desire to leave. That's their country, their culture, their language, their people.
I was referring to those who are outside of Iran and who are in no man's land, so
yes,
to speak.
and Mr. Mitchell,
status. Yes.
Mr. Mitchell has directed our petition to you in that regard, and you're correct, and thank you.
And of course, I am concerned about the internal problems that exist now in Iran for those who reside there and the children and families who have no intention of coming to the United States who perhaps cannot come for a number of reasons. And that is something that has to be given some careful thought, and to the extent that I can be personally be helpful, I would like to be in touch with you, Judge, about that.
Thank you.
The other questions are really of a human nature and personal. How does a Presbyterian become a Baha'i? I know Ms. Noorani at the age 15 made a personal declaration.
I was well past 15 at the time. I encountered this just before I entered law school, as a matter of fact. My wife and I came upon the Baha'i faith in a study of comparative religion. And after 5 years in the subject of comparative religion, we began to see that there was a thread which unites the peoples of the world in a belief in a common essence we call God, and that God had revealed his purpose in every age, and we came to believe that in this age of the maturity of mankind that Baha'u'llah was the spokesman for mankind now, and so we became dedicated to trying to establish the principles of the faith wherever we could. And we did it in the same way that a child would do it at 15, that is, or that anyone does it. And it is, as you have suggested, Mr. Chairman, a matter of internal conversion. It is a matter that once having done it, you will never be the same. And there isn't any way you could turn back the clock to what you were before. It's as if you leave one school and go on to the next,
though you may be loyal to your junior high school, you achieve even higher loyalties to your high school, to your college, and to your law school.
Professor, you think the absence of a high priest gives rise to suspicion among the mullahs in Iran? Because there's no priest-like figure in the Baha'i faith.
I don't think it's that. I think that it is the Baha'i abrogation of the clergy in its own religion. That is to say, all of a sudden it becomes clear to the people that you can actually get to heaven without your priest. And that is a very...
That sounds threatening.
And that is very threatening, indeed. And of course, I do not dismiss at all, I don't think that it would be correct, the fact that some of the mullahs, not all of them, but some of them, are perfectly sincere in their hatred of the Baha'is. People do take their religion seriously. We Baha'is know it from our end, from the victim's end, but we cannot deny it to the perpetrator of the crime either. And so some of these mullahs are absolutely sincere. They feel that they have the monopoly of truth. They know the will of God, and the will of God is that the renegade shall die. The person who believes differently shall not be permitted to believe differently. And here, Baha'is stand up and make what to the mullahs are outrageous and heretical statements, and what is a good mullah to do? He has to act it out. And this is the essence. Now, among the mullahs also, there are opportunists, time servers, all kinds of vicious and evil people who don't even kill cleanly. When you are killed with cause, you are killed righteously, so to speak, by someone who believes, at least you have the satisfaction of facing someone in whom you recognize a fellow human being. He believes his way and you believe yours. There is a clash and you are dead. You are a martyr. That is not as awful as being killed under accusation of being a Russo-Americo-British-Israeli spy. That demeans, and a prostitute, yes. You see, that demeans the whole discourse. It turns this into some kind of a bloody travesty.
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple more questions. Mr. Mitchell, what is the phenomena that accommodates such a large percentage of blacks in the Baha'i faith? I find that very fascinating, that statistical information.
I think it would be hard to describe the phenomenon itself, but the Baha'is do believe in the unity of mankind. And Baha'u'llah has spoken very strongly about the necessity of eliminating all forms of prejudice, racial or otherwise. And this has been taught to American Baha'is in very particular ways, because in 1912, the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith visited this country, was here for about 9 months, spoke at various places, spent time in Washington, D.C., spoke at Howard University. And one of the statements that he made, in fact, was that the unity of the whites and the blacks in America would be a cause of the world's peace. And the Baha'is take this very seriously. And so I think that a number of blacks in this country find this very appealing.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do not have a form in front of me to sign yet, Mr. Chairman. I'm pretty close to it.
Probably we'll get one right after, but you got to have the experience too, Mr. Donnelly.
Yes, give me a little time, will you?
Well, it seems to me that that there are several threats to the clergy in Iran. One is how you practice the faith. Because the Islamic faith is fairly rigid in social manners. And it's something of a theocracy when it's now being translated into government form, so it's not a matter, I mean, the law becomes far more extensive as to the rights of women and educational standards and so forth. So I think whenever you depart from the faith, that you get into that sort of thing. And again, going back to the parallel with the Jews and the Christians, that what Christ was preaching was a departure, a very dramatic departure from the law, however it was being practiced at the day, the Sabbath and so on and so forth. But, of course, they tried to embrace the law insofar as possible so that they weren't deviating too much from it. Yours may be a little more distinct. And secondly, it seems like since the birth of the Baha'is that Iran, over the course of history, has needed scapegoats from time to time to distract attention from other problems. And, Professor, you state here that the mullahs needed a scapegoat that could be blamed for the decline of Islam and for all the ills that beset a rapidly changing society experiencing the full force of westernization. And, of course, the most recent example is that with Iran being literally torn apart and various factions and the lack of central authority and so forth, they need a scapegoat. And once again, however they can rationalize it, it's the Baha'is. So I really feel this hearing has really given us a good focus because we're attempting to identify religious persecution wherever it exists. And we had a difficult time trying to decide whether we should look at regions of the world, as we have in our hearings on human rights violations, or whether we should attempt to single out certain examples of persecution. I think I gather from the testimony today that we're on the right track. If we're going to really focus attention, we've got to look specifically at where that persecution exists. I want to thank each of you for your testimony. You've certainly contributed to our understanding. You may have picked up a convert or two through today's hearings, and the committee will be working on a resolution that will have some teeth in it so that we can attempt to extend this concern not only beyond the Congress, but hopefully through the UN Commission on Human Rights and through a resolution and Mr. Novak's efforts, perhaps set up a working group that would provide more consistent monitoring of the situation in Iran. I want to thank all of you for being here today. Mr. Leach, did you have any additional words?
Thank you.
Yeah. Subcommittee stands adjourned.